Welcome to our webinar today. Our webinar is called Failing Incinerators, Demand Zero Waste Solutions. The goal of today's webinar is to share the recent findings of a groundbreaking study from the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School in New York City. And that new report showed that nearly 80% of the US's aging incinerators are located in environmental justice communities. We're also going to hear from folks who are community leaders that have been fighting incinerators through a just transition to zero waste solutions. And so this webinar today is actually designed for folks who are interested in learning more about the impact of incinerators on health and why it is now time for cities and communities to transition towards zero waste solutions. So again, welcome. Hi, can folks hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, did you hear my introduction or did I just talk at nothing? Very confused. Okay, so our speakers today are Ana Baptista with the New School, Destiny Watford from Baltimore, and Katie Andreski. Ana is the Associate Director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School. Prior to the New School, she served as the Director of Environmental Justice and Community Development at the Ironbound Community Corporation in her hometown of Newark, New Jersey. Ana's professional practice is focused on advancing environmental justice through collaborative work with communities on issues ranging from cumulative impacts to waste systems. Her current research includes studies on state-level climate justice policies, municipal zoning and planning measures for environmental justice, and zero waste policies. We have also with us today Destiny Watford. As a youth activist, Destiny inspired residents of a Baltimore neighborhood to defeat plans to build the nation's largest incinerator less than a mile away from her school. She co-founded Free Your Voice, a student organization dedicated to community rights and social justice, and is now a community organizer at United Workers based in Baltimore, Maryland. And finally, our last speaker will be Katie Andreski. Katie is with Breathe Free Detroit. She's their campaign organizer. She's a seasoned activist and a Detroiter who has lived in the shadow of the incinerator for over a decade. And she works to educate and empower the community by carrying out public engagement, public education, and community action campaigns. Before joining Breathe Free Detroit, she spent the 8 years of her career teaching in Detroit's urban farms and school gardens, reinforcing a sense of self-reliance, community engagement, and lessons from nature. So just a few things that I wanted to let you know as we kick off our webinar. For the audience, at the bottom or on your Zoom screen, you'll see an option for a Q&A. We will be taking questions from the audience and collecting those to answer at the end of all of the presentations. But if you have questions throughout the presentations, you can enter them through the Q&A box, and then we will get to them at the very end. And we have saved about 20 or 30 minutes for questions. So you'll definitely have an opportunity to hear answers to your questions. And with that, I don't think we have any other things. We can start with our first presentation with Ana. Ana, you can go ahead and start with your screen share. I'm going to close mine.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Just gonna Can you see my screen? Presentation's up?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so I am going to try to quickly touch on some of the highlights of this report we just recently released called the U.S. Municipal Solid Waste Incinerators and Industry in Decline. Oops. So some of the highlights of the report that I'm going to touch on include the finding of co-location of incinerators with environmental justice communities. I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the indicators of decline that we examined for the report, understanding the sort of industry model, the life expectancy of incinerators, and the costs associated with continuing to operate and maintain these facilities. We also examined the revenue model for these facilities and how volatile and risky they are, particularly for public taxpayers, and the increasing attention that zero waste, environmental justice, and climate change can bring pressure on the industry's model. And then lastly, a little bit about some of the health risks that incinerators pose in relationship to the host communities that they're in. So first, a little bit about the environmental justice findings. We started out with sort of a suspicion that most environmental justice communities have about most waste facilities, that there is a disproportionate siting of waste facilities across the country in communities of color and low-income communities. And we suspected that incinerators follow the same pattern that has been found in previous studies of hazardous waste sites and other waste facilities and industries that are polluting. Also based on some earlier reports like the Sorrell report, which is a very famous report that showed the targeting tactics of waste management industries around communities of color and low-income communities. And we looked particularly at the location of the incinerators, and we looked within a 3-mile radius of those facilities and looked at the demographics of the census tracts around those facilities. And we set a threshold based on our review of the literature of communities or census tracts that were 25% or more people of color, or 25% or more living below the poverty threshold. And what we found was that an overwhelming number of the facilities, 58 of the 73 facilities still in existence today, were located in environmental justice communities. That's almost 80% of the incinerators. And this map represents the presence of these facilities, and the ones in red represent facilities that are in communities that meet both thresholds of both poverty and race for the co-location of incinerators. So it really points to confirmation of what communities that are host communities have always suspected, have long suspected. And it's particularly important to highlight this relationship because when we talk about the health impacts and the economic impacts that these facilities have on local residents in the context of the fact that these communities are already overburdened, it's really important to consider. So a little bit more about the actual industry model. When we set out to do the report, Gaia was a partner in producing the report, and what we knew about these facilities is that they're aging, that most of them were built in the 1980s, and they rely heavily on subsidies and taxpayer dollars and sanitation contracts, and as they age, their operation and maintenance costs increase. So we know that incinerators cost a lot of money to build, somewhere between $100 to $600 million. But we also know now with the study that they cost a significant amount to operate and maintain. And so this schematic tries to capture both how these incinerators capture investment sources through public bonds, bonds that are structured by Wall Street firms, and tax abatements, public bonds from counties or city governments, and then how they rely on specific revenue streams. So Covanta, for example, which owns 22 facilities and operates 39, it's one of the largest companies in the market, and they derive 70% of their funds revenues from tipping. So despite the rebranding to waste to energy, these facilities are primarily garbage facilities, they're refuse facilities. That's how they make their money. That's their primary source of revenue. So if they start to get less garbage or those tipping fees are threatened, then their model is really on shaky ground. And in fact, Covanta's annual report, the most recent annual report, talks about their exposure to increasingly volatile energy and waste markets. This is part of what we looked at. We also looked at the energy sales that they're increasingly reliant upon, both through selling electricity and steam and smaller amounts in terms of selling scrap metals. So some of the indicators of decline, we had a sense of the trend of decline from the multiple closures. We've estimated at about 30 closures since 2000, and that's probably an underestimate. Those were just the ones we could find that were publicly being reported about. And there hasn't been an incinerator built. There's only one incinerator that's been built since the 2000s in Florida. So the average age of the incinerator is about 30 years old. The life expectancy of these plants is 30 years. So they're reaching the end of their life expectancy. We also know that that this age is contributing to the increased costs of maintaining them. So the average operation and maintenance cost for facilities falls within the range of $17 to $24 million annually. And this potentially will increase with time. We looked at a couple of case studies like the York facility, and we saw that they have an annual profit of 1.2 million, so that if their tipping fees fall by as little as 15 to 20%, or their operation and maintenance costs increase by that much, the facility would no longer be profitable. So this is an important piece of the puzzle. What we also saw is that the age of the facilities is also leading to costly upgrades and retrofits, and this requires new rounds of capital investment, which can be risky for investors and for public entities who subsidize them. So we're seeing that many cities are entering into giving tax abatements or direct taxpayer subsidies, or floating new public bonds to upgrade these older plants with great risk to the municipalities, because there's no guarantee that they'll get that money back. Many of the facilities are reliant on long-term sanitation contracts that are also coming to the end of their term. So there were 20 or 30-year sanitation contracts that they signed. And once those are up, many of the contractors or cities or counties are renegotiating more competitive tipping fees, or they're removing put or pay clauses that require them to deliver a set amount of waste, because cities want to recycle more, go towards zero waste more, and so they don't want to be on the hook for delivering certain amounts of high volumes of waste to these facilities with a penalty. So this is another area where their revenue model is at risk. And then finally, in terms of energy sales, we know that the operation and maintenance costs for running an incinerator makes it the most expensive way to generate electricity in the country, despite the fact that they generate less than 0.5% of all total US electricity generation. These facilities, the incinerator industry has successfully lobbied to get themselves considered renewable form of energy, and 23 states, municipal solid waste incineration is considered a renewable form of energy under the renewable portfolio standards. So 49 incinerators of the 73 have access to these subsidies. And there are 14 states and 3 cities where incineration gets net metering, which means that incinerators can sell their excess energy to a utility at a premium. There are also power purchase agreement contracts where incinerators can sell directly to a utility or a trader for a set amount, a set price. So all of these subsidies are increasingly coming under attack or are the subject of lots of activism because, in fact, garbage incineration is not renewable and has lots of potential health risks to communities. And so their access to renewable energy markets is not as clear. And increasingly, cities and states are looking at carbon taxes and other forms of climate mitigation strategies where incinerators would not fare well either. They would, if they were included in those carbon pricing schemes, they would have to pay quite a bit of money. In terms of the health impacts, we did look at some of the impacts of burning very heterogeneous municipal garbage. You can imagine all of the toxic products that are in our consumer products, and burning that produces emissions that are health-harming emissions. So we know that incinerators emit criteria air pollutants like nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and also hazardous air pollutants like lead and dioxins. And some of these pollutants, like dioxins, have no known lower threshold for which there is no health impact on humans. So, any amount of dioxin is bad for humans, and these facilities are significant sources of things like dioxin and mercury here in the US and around the world. You can see in the EU and globally, they are large contributors to those emissions. So what we also know about incinerators is that they are not currently required to have continuous emissions monitoring for all the pollutants of concern. And so this is an area of concern because we really don't have an accurate accounting of all the emissions that they contribute. And we know that they're located in communities that are already overburdened. So this underestimation and the fact that we don't consider cumulative impacts or the precautionary principle in the regulation of these facilities can be problematic. So we looked at a couple of things, including the relative emissions of the incinerators across the country, their enforcement and compliance history, and the facilities' emissions from truck fleets and from and their emissions in terms of contribution to areas not in attainment for the national air quality standards. So we try to give people a sense of the relative emissions that these facilities contribute. And so these dirty dozen lists rank facilities, the incinerators, the 73 facilities across the US. And the blue ranks them according to the amount of the pollutant. So for example, NOx, the amount of NOx emitted, the pounds of NOx emitted per ton of waste burned annually. So it gives you a rate. And they're ranked by rate. So the incinerator that has the highest rate emissions for NOx is the Mid-Maine Waste Action Corporation in Maine. They emit about 7.7 pounds of NOx per ton of waste burned. In orange, you'll see the total amount of pounds annually of emissions from these facilities. And for example, for NOx, the highest emitting facility is the Haverhill facility in Massachusetts, which emits 1.8 million pounds of NOx annually. And so this is, and then the little stars next to it indicate which of these facilities are EJ facilities, and you can see most of them are in EJ communities. For the PM levels, you see that the facility that has the highest total emissions annually is the Delaware Valley, Chester, Pennsylvania facility with over 200,000 pounds of PM 2.5, and the Wheelabrator facility in Gloucester has the highest rate. And then you can see the same thing. We looked at 7 pollutants of concern, and we were showing 4 here that are the health-harming pollutants like mercury and lead. I like to point out that on the lead side, we see that, well, for mercury, the same facility is ranked the highest for both rate and the total pounds of mercury, the Babylon facility in New York. And then in lead, we see that Newark has the Essex County Covanta facility has the highest total amount of lead, over 600 pounds of lead per year. So very high numbers. So I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to skip over. But this just shows you how incinerators are contributing to air pollution in areas that are already in non-attainment for the national air quality standards. And we also tried to calculate and capture the emissions contributions from the sanitation trucks, which are very inefficient and very polluting and are not included in the permitting of these facilities. So I'm happy to answer any questions, because I know I probably skipped over a lot of things, but thank you.
Thank you, Anna. For the audience, just two quick notes. If you do have questions, there's a Q&A box on your screen, and so you can actually enter questions, and Anna and the other presenters will have an opportunity to answer those questions at the end. And then also, just a quick note, that the presentations will also be available with the recording. And if you signed up through our sign up form, you'll get an email with the recording and the presentations in about a day or two, as soon as we've collected them all back. So up next, we have Destiny Watford from United Workers. As soon as you're ready, Destiny, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Hi, y'all. Okay, so I wanted to give an overview of our past campaign and fight to stop the nation's largest trash burning incinerator from being built less than a mile away from our neighborhood, Curtis Bay, and also talk a little bit more about what we're doing currently and what that means in Baltimore, but also connects to this global fight for environmental justice. So, about 6 years ago, when I was in high school, I co-founded a group called For Your Voice, which was a human rights group that was focused on looking at our human rights, from housing to creating a just, like looking at our criminal system, our housing, vacant homes. But the issue that really hit us the most, specifically in our neighborhood in South Baltimore, was environmental justice. And this came in the form of the plan to build the nation's largest trash burning incinerator, less than a mile away from our school. So we learned about this in about 2012, and I just want to highlight that this incinerator, what we would find is like the three main reasons like why it was constructed was due to political values that were not our own, that the economics piece of like this incinerator would bring jobs to the neighborhood, even though that wasn't necessarily true. And also this political fight, this fight for economics, but also just values, would be central for our fight in stopping it. So when we first started to stop the incinerator, all of these decisions, the legal decisions, the economic decisions, and the political decisions were already made. To put this into context, at the time, our mayor, Governor O'Malley, supported the project, as well as our Governor O'Malley and our mayor, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, supported the project and talked about it as if it was this golden example of what development looks like in Baltimore. In Maryland, incineration is considered green, so it receives millions of dollars in public subsidies every year. And the argument that the incinerator was making, the economic argument, was that it would bring jobs to the neighborhood. And so it was a great development. That was the argument. But what we found is that not only did it violate our basic human right to breathe clean air, because the incinerator would have been burning 4,000 tons of trash every day and was permitted to release 240 pounds of mercury and 1,000 pounds of lead, but we also would find that the jobs that the incinerator was offering wouldn't be going to the folks in the neighborhood. We have a high unemployment rate. A lot of folks in our neighborhood hadn't finished high school, and the jobs that were available that the incinerator was offering would be high-tech, high-skilled jobs that would require years of education that folks in the neighborhood didn't have. And so we realized very quickly that this incinerator wasn't really promising wouldn't bring any real value to the neighborhood and would in fact be putting our lives at risk. And so we decided to take action. So the incinerator would have been built in a neighborhood called Fairfield, which has our neighborhood has a very long history of air pollution. For example, we're more likely to die of lung cancer, of respiratory disease, and to suffer from asthma because of the polluted air that surrounds us. To give more into that, there were once several neighborhoods in the community, Fairfield, Rogers Point, and Hawkins Point, that have all been essentially destroyed because of the polluting industries that took over the neighborhood. And now we're dealing with the consequences. To put that even more into perspective, I can expect an entire decade to be shaved off of my life because of where I grew up. So we knew the incinerator wasn't fair. We spent years, about 5 years, fighting it on a political, legal, and economic scale. So we made very clear the argument in public and also to our neighbors as we did outreach that incineration isn't necessary. As you, Anna, we're talking about that zero waste and alternatives creates 2 to 3 times more jobs than incineration does. And if we truly invested in that in our city and poured as many resources as we do to incineration towards these alternatives, we can make a real difference in the way that we deal with waste in Baltimore. On a legal scale, what this meant for us was fighting to do 2 things. One, fighting to account for cumulative impacts, because one of the reasons that the incinerator was even permitted to exist within a less than a mile from a school, my high school, was because they deemed themselves as, they didn't call themselves an incinerator, they saw themselves as renewable, and so did our government. And so to change that, the incinerator would have, if it were constructed, it would have been surrounded by a lot of other polluting industries. And what our legal system and government don't put into context is that when you have many of these polluting industries together clustered in an area, specifically in a poor neighborhood, most common for a predominantly Black neighborhood, we get a lot more of the burden. And so one of our main focuses was focusing on that aspect of fighting to take account for cumulative impact. The second was making sure that the subsidies that we're paying as taxpayers don't go to polluting our air, and instead go to the actual alternatives that they should be going to, like wind and solar, and true alternatives. So at the time, the incinerator, another piece of its economics was that it would have been buying energy, that 22 public institutions in Baltimore and Maryland would have been buying energy from the incinerator, and this included the Baltimore City public school system, which was a huge shock to us as students, because the very same system that we were a part of, that we were learning from, would be contributing to something that could kill us. And so we spent a long time organizing those institutions and talking to them and basically giving them the choice of doing the right thing, which meant getting out of their contracts with the incinerator. And as we called it the divestment campaign. And as we went through this process and specifically hammering down on the Baltimore City school system, I remember we had this huge event at the in front of the Baltimore City School Board. And I remember being inches away from the school board, and we wrote poems and songs and speeches about why they should not support the incinerator. And I remember two members of our group, specifically Leah and Audrey, singing a song about what it's like to grow up in a place like Curtis Bay, and what it means to fight for something that you believe in, environmental justice. And it got a standing ovation. And after that moment, I remember key school board members coming down to the neighborhood, seeing what it was like to live here, and really taking a stand and refusing to support the incinerator. And as the Baltimore City public school system got out of their contracts, Baltimore City government followed, as well as all of the other entities. They kind of fell over like dominoes. And that was huge because the incinerator now didn't have any customers. And it's what helped us win our huge battle with the incinerator. And to summarize this piece, we spent 5-6 years organizing our neighborhood, organizing our political officials, and trying to change legislation. And that groundwork really changed the course. It sounds really like, what I'm trying to say is the work that we did on the ground changed the coursework of environmental justice in Baltimore and allowed for a lot of really cool things to happen. And because of this new positive push towards renewable energy and zero waste, and not backing these bad developments like Incinerator, really cool things started to happen. The Baltimore Compost Collective, which is our first youth-led zero waste business in South Baltimore, started to flourish. There was a piece of legislation that was passed called the Clean Air Act that would force stricter restrictions on our current incinerator, Bresco. And right now, we're working on creating a zero waste plan and working with the top zero waste influencers and policymakers in the state or in the country. So that's really cool, and we're taking a lot of huge strides. But despite all of this victory that we've had within the previous incinerator fight, we're still relying largely on incineration in Baltimore. Our incinerator in Baltimore is called Bresco, and it creates 1/3 of the air pollution in the city. And despite this, over 80% of the waste that's burned at Bresco could be recycled or composted. And we have a real opportunity to change the way that we think about waste and do waste in Baltimore, because the incinerators contract is coming up in 2021. So the incinerator, of course, is going to fight really hard to hold on to waste and hold on to the control that they have in the city, with the majority of the waste coming to them to be burned. So they say, if we shut down Bresco, we have to build a second landfill, and that we, the activists, the residents on the ground who are really pushing for a zero waste plan and implementation, are misinformed. And they're wrong, because the reality is that we have big visions, but we have the actions and the plans to back them up. So as I mentioned, we've hired the nation's top influencer and policymaker when it comes to zero waste plans. And we youth out of Ben Franklin, the high school that I graduated from, are spearheading what they call the Zero Waste Challenge, which is a challenge from them to their fellow classmates and residents and policymakers and decision makers to actually take this on and implement. The way that they're taking on the Zero Waste Challenge is by building upon the compost collective and building it out and creating a strong zero waste business in South Baltimore that will scale up composting on a big level. The way that some of our political leaders are taking on the Zero Waste Challenge is by supporting and helping to implement zero waste policies and infrastructures and supporting our plan. So I talked about how we are working to create a zero waste plan and working with the top zero waste. This is just talking more about that. I think I kind of finished my presentation, guys. So this is all to say, like, we started as a small group that was working on human rights and saw an incinerator and environmental injustice in our neighborhood. And right now we're really leading the way along with youth from Ben Franklin to reshape the way that we think about waste and create waste in Baltimore. And instead of burning it at an incinerator that puts our lives at risk, we are working to compost and recycle at really large scales. And it's really exciting, and I'm really happy about it. So if folks have any questions or thoughts, I am here.
Thank you, Destiny. That was great. Yeah, so just a reminder again, if you've got questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box, and we'll have an opportunity to have those questions answered at the end. And the final presentations will also be available for us to share with you with the webinar recording. So KT, if you're ready, let me know and I can pull up your presentation.
Okay, thank you for sharing my presentation on your screen.
Great.
Yeah, I really
All right.
did it. I am ready. Hello, everybody.
And
okay, so Breathe Free Detroit just recently had a great win. Our campaign here helped end the incinerator that was up and running for 33 years. So this in this time, I'm gonna just run through a quick bit of how we did it and where we're gonna go from here. So in the next slide, this incinerator had 33 years of pressure. There were organized groups in opposition to the incinerator even during the construction of the facility in 1986. So this was one of those incinerators that it was past its 30-year amount of time that it was supposed to be operating. And so many different campaigns and residents and community organizations and advocates from many fields fought throughout this 33-year stretch to get this closed down. And just to show you, there's an article, a picture from an article in a newspaper on the left from 1986. And this is a picture of a balloon launch with a message. And so tied to each balloon was a note saying that whenever the wind, wherever the wind may carry a balloon, it could also carry the pollutants from the incinerator. And so, and by Tuesday after this balloon launch, the balloons had already been reported landing in Ontario and in New York State. So the next slide, I'm going to just go through our most recent developments. So in 2018, the Detroit Incinerator Primer, our report, was published, and this report was prepared by the Breathe Free Detroit campaign and the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center to serve as a resource for individuals and organizations and government representatives that are interested in the history and current operations of the Detroit Renewable Power incinerator. So I'm going to be calling this DRP and the incinerator. We in Detroit always just called it the incinerator, but I don't want anybody to get confused when I'm switching the names up. So we work to engage the community and research the financial ties and public health effects of the incinerator, and it's all put into this report. So this is a 16-page report, and it covered the construction and design, services including solid waste disposal, electricity generation, and steam sales. It also covered the air quality and the makeup of the neighborhood around the incinerator, common health effects that are caused by this incinerator, and a conclusion that ultimately shut it down. A link to this report and the other materials that I'm going to be talking about will be in the last slide and also sent out for you guys later on in reference. Next slide. So this slide was a really helpful part of our campaign for when we would go door to door. This was our fact sheet, and so you see here the front and back of it. So this helped immensely to inform the community of our findings in the report. So a lot of the things that were in the report in longer ways were really concise and condensed in this form. There's so much information packed into this front and back printed sheet, including health effects, how the incinerator was a prime example of environmental racism, and how to be an active community member by reporting odors and concerns to MDEQ, which is the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, which is now changed to EGLE. So then the next slide, we partnered with Ocelot Print Shop, a local art organization and print shop here, and they helped us print out these large signs that were hung up all over the communities that lived around the incinerator. So these were just public signs we posted on telephone poles and all over outside where people would be walking around. So multiple calls from the community were made because of the odor concerns that led to multiple violations recorded by MDEQ. So these really helped add up to the multiple violations that this incinerator started to incur, I think from 2013. So the public signs hung in places where you could smell the odors of the rotting trash, and where people were just walking around, so they would be able to know how to call. The phone numbers on here were phone numbers for MDEQ to report the odor, but also we included the phone number for the mayor, just so he was aware of the nuisance that it was causing in our neighborhood. So it was a great way for folks to act upon the stink in our neighborhood. So into the next slide. One of the really big moments of 2018 was in May. 15,000 petition signatures were delivered to the mayor urging him to close down the facility. And there was a public press conference as well. After this event, meetings with the mayor's office were set up following this, as well as a lot of press hits and articles written. This was really helpful and energizing to many folks in Detroit to realize that this is still an issue, that there are so many residents here that are against it, and it proved it through a online petition that was delivered straight to the mayor. in the next slide, you'll see also one of the more recent things that we started to do was put up air monitors to record the air quality. And it was public air monitors that we used. We used purple air monitors to detect particulate matter, but we also had a few air qual monitors to pick up NOx and ozone and PM10 2.5. So the purple air monitors have their own online way of showing what the air quality is. I just took a picture of it the other day where everybody was in green, which is really great. It was a very sunny, nice day out. And so these air monitors were put up around the incinerator, and we also put them up in schools and community sites to increase air quality awareness. So this also increased our campaign members and community participation. So it was really helpful to give something to the community that they can really see. They can check on it online. If you're not familiar with the purple air monitors, you can go online at any point in time and see what your air quality is wherever it's set up. They're pretty cheap air monitors. They're just a little over $200. The air qual monitors were able to add different elements to it, and they cost quite a bit more, so we weren't able to get as many. But the schools really did appreciate having these, and they did a lot of great work with their students in understanding the air quality around. In the next slide, one of the biggest moments of our campaign was the citizen lawsuit. So the Ecology Center and the Environment Michigan, represented by lawyers at the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center and the National Environmental Law Center, issued a notice of intent to sue the Detroit Renewable Power for ongoing repeated violations under the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act includes provisions for this kind of citizen suit, allowing citizens to step into the shoes of the regulators to sue a facility when it is not in compliance and the regulatory agency is not doing their job adequately. So pretty much MDEQ was set out to fine the facility for over 600 at that time, over 600 air quality violations, and they only fined them for 8. So as citizens, we stepped into the shoes of MDEQ to fine them for the rest of them. And so at that point in time, they had over 800 violations because so much time had passed. So the citizen lawsuit intent to sue letter was sent out on February, or actually I put that wrong. It was actually right at the end of January for a 60-day waiting period to see if they will come into compliance or settle within this time. And within only 5 days remaining, the incinerator announced it was closing that day. And this was in March, on March 27th. So they stated that it's just not financially viable to continue operations as is, and it's just too expensive to correct the pollution control issues to be a good neighbor. So pretty much they closed down because they realized they were going to be fined a huge amount of money for polluting, and they realized that they couldn't continue operations without polluting. I can answer any more questions regarding the citizen lawsuit later on if anybody has them. In the next slide, another, I think, sorry, my slides are different than this, but yes. So what's next with the incinerator? We're in an area of already changing neighborhood. There is a construction right across the street of a new jail and court building that started about a month before the incinerator closed. There's a lot of new development of the Eastern Market trying to press for a food industrial zone all the way north of the incinerator. And the Detroit Renewable Power would not have been a good neighbor for any of it. And the people funding these projects knew this as well. So I did want to just flag this as well as developers. You can see them when they start creeping in, you could kind of tell that something is going to be changing. So the suddenness of this closure, we didn't know. We found out the day that they closed at 1 p.m. and so did their workers. So the suddenness of this closure didn't leave us prepared to protect the workers who lost their jobs that day. and the residents' right to stay in their home. So we're worried that the development is quickly positioning itself around us now, and that the air quality is improved. So our continued work deals with this and so much more. Next slide. I guess I missed my one slide. There's one slide in there about our community event. So I'm just going to talk about it now because I'm not sure if it just didn't pop up because I did have a weird image in there. But before I go into this slide, we had a really great strategy of community events that were hosted in different places throughout the neighborhoods that surrounded the incinerator. And we had multiple events, from World Asthma Day events to a tree planting event to a clothing swap, so that we would reduce clothes that went into the trash. We had a town hall and many different ways to show that, you know, we're still present. We had the Detroit Light Brigade had a big sign of light up signs that said end incineration. We made big signs of clean air, clean energy, and clean jobs, and used them in our protests. So that slide is not showing, but I wanted to really share that this strategy of monthly events in different locations that were familiar to the immediate community were key to our movement forward as well. Once a location was set, like, our strategy was that we would have these community locations, and once it was set, we would fly around the immediate community surrounding the host location to create a truly localized support system. The community the community events hosted in community-run spaces around the incinerator allowed for many community leaders to continue their support as we move from space to space, strategically circling the incinerator. And so this actually continued a lot of support that we have today, because people really felt like they were a big part of this. So in the current slide that's showing what's next, the just transition for the workers. So we were really taken aback about what we needed to do for the workers. So we made ourselves very loud and clear to political leaders that later, if workers needed a just transition to cleaner union jobs and a city, and the city picked up on this, and they hosted career fairs, and specifically to the 160 laid off workers of Detroit Renewable Power. The firefighters union and a few other unions reached out to accept new workers from this transition. There's still no policy that protects union workers from closures, or any workers at all, from closures of polluting facilities. And as we realize how little time we have to change from operating these polluting facilities to cleaner technologies, we need to be sure that the workers are protected first in any transition within our cities and in our nation. The air quality work for the incinerator closure is still dealing with the pollution issues of the U.S. Ecology and Toxic Waste Facility, which is right across the street from the incinerator. So as a community, we're still fighting another waste facility. It's not necessarily incinerating, but they're doing some pretty bad things. So as we, in the next slide, thanks Denise. As we move forward, we are continuing to monitor the air. One of the things that I wanted to let anybody know who has an incinerator in their community is that it's been recorded throughout history, the recent history of incinerators, that when an incinerator shuts down, there is a higher amount of pollution right at the end of its life. I'm not sure if it's because people just don't care anymore or any case, but the incinerator did start up again for 3 days on Memorial Day weekend to do some maintenance on their steam plant. They addressed this at City Council meeting. They gave us a public announcement the day that they were starting up. It was during Memorial Day weekend, which is the first weekend that everybody can stay outside. So we were, as a campaign, very concerned about our neighbors and the community that we've been working with. So we had all of our air monitors up and running at that time, These pictures right here that you see are snapshots of the purple air. And so we're still analyzing this data. I am completely unsure as to why the bottom left-hand corner is off the charts. And that one, Air Monitor, is set up at a local school. So we're looking into this still. And the immediate response was to monitor, like we set up these monitors during Memorial Day so that the steam plant could maintain it, but the air quality work for the incinerator closure we're still dealing with the pollutions from the U.S. Ecology and Toxic Waste area. Sorry, I'm stumbling over some roads. So we're still in this process of monitoring. In the next slide. So what's next? One of the things that we are focusing on is a just transition for residents. So not just a just transition for the workers and a not just transition for our trash, but also just transition for the residents. And so for the residents of this environmental justice community, life is really changing. Only 2 months after the closure, one of my neighbors died of stage 4 lung cancer. The facility may be shut down, but the community is still feeling its effects. The health effects are still living with all the kids that have asthma. They're still living with all the communities that live around there. And we want to make sure that this is addressed. We are working to protect the residents so that they can stay in their homes and not be pushed out through the impending gentrification measures that affect so many environmental justice communities like this all over the world. We're working on another gentrification packet to provide resources for homeowners, renters, community members experiencing negative changes in their neighborhood, information on how to create a community block club and neighborhood association so that community members can have a stronger say in what's going to be happening in their neighborhood, and stricter demands for a community benefits agreement for the new developments. For these residents that have lived through the worst of times under the pollution of this incinerator, they should now be able to stay and live through the best of times to stay in their homes without this pollution. And as a campaign, we're working to make sure that those resources are available for these community members so that they can stay in their homes. In the next slide, we are also working with a just transition for zero waste, for our waste through zero waste. We're pushing City Council and working with Councilman Benson's Green Task Force to support all zero waste efforts for the future municipal waste operations in Detroit. We work closely with Zero Waste Detroit, who has been instrumental in getting recycling bins to households across the city, as well as pushing public policy to adopt stricter zero waste methods. The composting of Detroit's waste is mostly in the form of yard waste at this moment, and so for city, and that's in any city contracts. So there's many urban farms across the city that do small to mid-sized composting on their own, and many residents, they have backyard compost bins, but there's no citywide composting pickup system. In creating policy for citywide composting, the Green Task Force is also helping to protect all forms of composting from backyard to municipal composting systems, so that one large composting contract doesn't wipe out all the grassroots and independent efforts. There's a great opportunity for business development in this area of composting and recycling, because right now only 4% of the Detroit's waste is recycled, and only 27% of Detroit's households participate in curbside recycling. We have an opt-in recycling program, which means that people have to pay $25, a one-time cost, to receive a recycle bin, and it's picked up only every other week. There are programs through Zero Waste Detroit for people to receive free recycle bins, but they have to have that resource available to them to reach out, and a lot of people are just unaware of it. We are hoping that it can just be a citywide composting pickup and recycling program that's not opt-in eventually. And so the mayor and the city council realize that recycling and composting are going to be key elements in our future waste management system, and seem to have found a new immediacy for this system since the incinerator shut down. In the city council meetings, they now all of a sudden realize that we should have been recycling all along, but the recycling and composting, again, was feeding the incinerator, so they didn't really push the immediacy until after it closed. In the next slide, so we're also concerned about the facility deconstruction. we're starting to do some research around what that actually means, what havoc that's going to raise in our air and in our community. So we're currently advocating to City Council to for a process to involve community residents, to have a say in determining what the future uses are for that site, and conduct outreach to engage community members. In the process, the site is owned by the city, so it's publicly owned land, even though it's a private facility. So we're also advocating the city and for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, which was formerly MDEQ, to ensure that community health protection in the demolition and deconstruction of the facility and cleanup of the site is as clean as possible. So we continue to monitor and watch any changes in this facility, as the final closure is set for late fall, when they will either prepare to mothball the facility and leave it as another abandoned facility in our neighborhood, or take it down through demolition and deconstruction. So this is what is going to be happening next. We're not exactly sure what route they're all going to be taking. In the next slide, we realize now in Detroit that all of our trash, and the trash that was coming to Detroit from the suburbs and other states and Canada even, that was being incinerated, is now going to different places according to the contracts that each county or state has. So our county is now taking all of its trash and putting this burden that we were receiving, and now is putting this into a landfill that's 30 miles east of Detroit, called Carlton Landfill. This landfill is right next to a marshland, and this picture that you see here are all of the waterways that are underneath this area, and the star is where that landfill is. And so the red waterways are all polluted waterways that we have here in Michigan. The green waterways are unpolluted, and so it is a big concern of ours that our trash is now being sent to fill up in this landfill that's sitting above unpolluted waterways. And Michigan is a water state, and we're pretty concerned about this. And so the trash that once went to this incinerator is now going to nearby landfill, and our burden is being put on another community. So in the next slide, I did want to share, if anybody is going to be around, we are going to be having a local event here, a town hall, to talk about all these things, talk about all this just transition with our waste, and also another just transition with energy, which I didn't touch on as much here. We're going to be streaming this event Facebook Live, so you can like our Facebook page and even watch it. We have Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who's our Congresswoman here in Detroit. And she's going to be headlining it with all these great organizations that we've been working with to shut this down. So after 33 years, the incinerator is now closed, but many issues remain unresolved. Experts and community leaders at this town hall will discuss protections for workers and residents, what residents want to see in the site of the former incinerator, how to move Detroit towards zero waste and related topics. Social justice organizations, including Good Jobs Now, the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, Solidarity, Detroit Dirt, Zero Waste Detroit, and Empower Michigan will also be participating in this conversation. So this fight has been multiple organizations large, and we still all work together because we're all touching on many different issues that the world is seeing right now and that we're seeing here in Detroit and dealing with. And we're going to keep moving forward to try to create a just solution for every one of it. So that pretty much concludes my talk. So if you want to go to the next slide, there's some links here to for my contact for our Facebook page if you want to see that town hall, and the fact sheet and the incinerator primer can be found on the ecocenter.org website if anybody's interested in learning more or seeing what that's all about.
Great, thank you, Katie. That was great. I'm going to stop my screen share. And we can take audience questions. So, let's see, we had questions in a couple of places. There was a Q&A, some questions in the Q&A and a few in the chat box. So I'm gonna be flipping back and forth a little bit, just so folks in the audience know. If you have additional questions or think of something as we're addressing other questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, because that's going to be where we're going to be monitoring. So there's a question from one of the audience members about air monitoring around 4th of July. And so the question is, should we be monitoring the heavy metals and other pollutants released from pyrotechnics, like around fireworks? I think one of the questions around that, maybe Katie, you can answer this, or Anna, is if some of the air monitors that you've been using or able to detect anything like that, or if they're like specific to the types of emissions that come out of the incinerators. If you could answer a general question like that, just about the air monitoring, that would be great. I'm not sure about, and if you can answer about 4th of July, feel free to.
I mean, I can't specifically answer about fireworks because I only help install the monitors, to be honest. There's other scientists that are working with us that would be able to answer this better that are not on this call. But I do know that our particulate matter, the purple air monitors would even pick up if somebody, I put one up on the back of my house just for a test run, and when we barbecued or if somebody walked by with a cigarette, it would even spike. So it would pick up the smoke of a firework, but I'm not exactly sure all the results that it would be able to explain.
Thanks, Katie, for that. So another question that came in, I think this can be answered by anyone, and maybe in the context of either national or local politics, or government response relations in politics. But there's a question that says, how did the government respond to understanding the failure of incinerators? And I think a little bit of this is in response to the report that was put out by the new school. But in general, I think it would be great if Katie and Destiny, you could talk a little bit more about how your local governments have responded to your campaigns as they gained a better understanding of like what the problems were with the incinerators. I don't know if Anna, you want to answer that question first, just in response to the report some of the responses to the report you might have seen so far, if there's anything to share.
We haven't seen a response to the report from, well, that's not true. I actually did get a request from the state of New Jersey and a couple of cities to send them the report, particular, I think, to specific incinerators where they were seeing emissions levels that, they wanted to look at. I think generally the lesson from looking across the country at all these facilities and the economics of these plants and how risky they are, I think increasingly more conscientious and thoughtful legislators and decision makers are taking into account the fact that not only are these facilities polluting and targeting communities that are already overburdened, but they are a bad financial deal. Like they're going to potentially create a lot of debt and a lot of long-term debt for taxpayers that they're going to have to float and explain to the residents of the communities. And so they become a liability for these communities. And I think for politicians, this is an important point of leverage to raise is, are you going to invest another round of public taxpayer dollars without a guarantee that these facilities, as they age, aren't going to start to completely break down and further harm the communities that you're supposed to be representing? So I think the report really tries to drive home the risks that public decision makers take on when they underwrite these facilities, and that they have to be accountable to the people who are bearing the burden, both financially and in terms of their health. So I'm hoping that the report can be used to highlight those dangers to decision makers, because if they're at the precipice of investing another round of money in these old facilities, this is a critical moment to make that the right decision, right? Which is not to continue to double down on these bad facilities.
Thanks, Anna. Destiny or Katie, did you want to add anything to that, just from your perspective about local government responses? Or what you hope to see out of the release of the report, or anything new that's come up?
Yeah, Destiny, did you want to go? I saw that you had. I'll go after.
Okay. So I think, so with like our fight and our campaign, I think the response has shifted from, well, this is the only thing that we have relied upon for so long, there's no alternatives, recycling isn't going to work, towards like, okay, how do we actually do this and like create that just transition that you were talking about, KT? So yeah, I think the conversations that we've been having now have been really healthy and really steered towards zero waste in a lot of our spaces. It's not the case for all of them, but yeah.
I just want to add to that, that our local government really didn't do much in terms of supporting our campaign. They barely showed up for any events. We gave them our report, and every time we gave it to them, it looked like they had received it for the first time again and again and again. So our mayor and many city council members that we were dealing with over the years just didn't really do much. Most of our support of political leadership came from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Stephanie Chang and some other state reps, Isaac Robinson, and so it was more on a state, federal level of support, because largely because of the work and the reports that are coming out on a national and global level from Gaia, and all of the consistencies that we're seeing from our community here in Detroit in comparison to Baltimore and Long Beach and all these other places that once we became part of this larger movement in Detroit, we realized that we're not alone, even though it felt like it was something that we're only the ones that are dealing with it. So once the incinerator here did shut down, though, every politician, no matter how silent they were before the event, every single politician wanted to say that they did it, so and we weren't prepared to have a recycling program. We weren't prepared to have a composting program, and so these things were not set in place, and now we're scurrying to figure it out. So I'm glad to hear that Baltimore is getting a lot more forward and having some good plans before it all comes down.
Thank you. And then, again, if anyone's got additional questions, please put them in the Q&A. There's one more question. Do any of you have a presentation or summary that's shareable that folks can use for teaching and discussion with schools or community groups? I don't know if that's something you've had an opportunity to develop or have developed for your own communities that's shareable. It would be kind of a cool resource. There's a question about that.
You mean like just a summary of the campaign and tactics that we've used?
I think so. It's like the question is, do you have an abbreviated version of the gist of this wonderful pitch suitable for presentation for teaching and discussion in schools and community groups? So I didn't know if there were other additional resources available, or if you have resources on your website that people can reference. That's good to know as well. I know the Gaia library has some resources, but maybe things that are a little bit more community specific from y'all would be helpful too.
Yeah, I'll look into what we've used. I'm not sure because I was teaching so much before this that I might have done it a lot off the cuff, but if there's anything, I'll include it in an email so that that's going to go out with the recording.
Yeah, same.
Awesome. So if we have any resources, we'll be happy to share those with the video link. Great. So I don't see any other questions from the audience. For each of the panelists, I don't know if there's a last message you want to share. And if so, you can go ahead and do that now and then we can wrap up. I'll just call folks off. Like Anna, do you want to go first? Last message.
I mean, I think if folks have any questions about the report or if there's anything we can do to help folks in their local campaigns, you know, if you're living with an incinerator in your backyard or you're facing down the prospect of an incinerator, you know, feel free to reach out to us, and I know Gaia as well, and we're happy to talk about the report findings and drive home the point that this is an important moment in the U.S. in terms of this industry, and we have a real opportunity to shift towards zero waste and just transitions. And this is the moment to do that rather than going back and reinvesting in these this terrible industry. So I'm hoping that you all will be inspired really by the work of Destiny and KT and all the other communities doing all the amazing work to get us to a more just and healthy future without these incinerators around. That's my hope.
Thanks. Destiny, you want to go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, as we're talking about incineration and just transition, I think one really important thing to take back is just that, like, this work is really complicated and messy, and like doing like deep community commitment and organizing takes time, and like really educating people so that as we make this just transition, it's truly a just transition.
Yeah. Katie?
I just want to thank everybody for being part of this call and having Breathe Free Detroit represented on this call. I really hope that what we were able to accomplish here can really help in all of the other fights that are going around the nation. And I know that in my work, as I move forward in how we're moving forward after the incinerator shut down, I do consider and think about all of the other cities like Baltimore and Long Beach in the work to make sure that it's something that can be utilized in the other cities that are going to be shutting their incinerators down as well. I also wanted to make a big point that part of the problem with incinerators and the pollution is the plastics. So this is a very tied in problem. If we can get rid of all the plastics in the world, a lot of our pollution issues with the incinerators would decrease as well. So onward to all the other fights that this is connected to.
Thank you, Katie. That was a great add-on. So again, thank you to all of our presenters today. Those are really great presentations, and I hope that everyone in the audience found them to be very informative. As I mentioned earlier, a recording of the webinar as well as the presentations will be sent to each of the participants. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to either the panelists directly. They've provided contact information in their presentations, or to us at Gaia. We'd be happy to address anything that comes up. With that, we can conclude. So thank you all. And we hope that you will join us again in a future installment of our webinar series.